Welcome to the 7th installment of our Better Together Food System Best Practices for Navigating COVID-19 discussion series. As you may remember, we hosted the first 5 of these calls earlier this spring, back at the beginning of the pandemic. Since then, we've continued to hear about a lot of challenges throughout the supply chain, as well as a lot of innovative and exciting best practices that are being put in place by our stakeholders. So we've decided to relaunch that series for an additional 4 installments. We started last week with a great discussion around reemergence that was focused on restaurant operators that are having to open and close and reopen and close again in some cases during these times, and encourage you to take a look at the notes and the recording from last week's discussion. As you know, ReFed primarily works to motivate and mobilize stakeholders throughout the food system in an attempt to advance solutions to food waste. We do that by acting as a catalyst to promote solution-driven action, as a connector to help facilitate partnership among our stakeholders, and finally as a source of data, insights, and best practices. So our hope is that we can be doing all of those throughout this discussion series and through the connections that are being made afterwards, so that we can continue to support our network during this time. As we do continue to learn about those needs throughout the network, and as well as best practices that are being implemented, we'll continue to have these wonderful discussions with our experts. Today, we're going to be focusing on the topic of forecasting. I believe it probably comes as no surprise that food supply and demand seem to be in constant flux during the COVID-19 pandemic. I know we all were very aware of that at the beginning, and I think we're continuing to see that flux continue throughout the lifespan of the pandemic and looking to the future as well. That's made forecasting, demand, and inventory planning all major challenges for people throughout the food system, which consequently is increasing food waste. So our panel of planning experts and food service players today are going to tell us more about the best practices that they're implementing and that you can implement to forecast more accurately and waste less food amidst all the uncertainty that we're facing. Before I introduce them, just really quickly would ask Lily if she can bring up a quick poll, again, to give us a better idea of who's on the call today and who the audience is. If you can choose the sector that best describes your organization, let's take just a minute to do that before we dive in. You should be able to see the results on your screen as well. Wonderful, thank you. A good split today, and just great participation across different sectors. So very excited to see that. And thank you, Lily. So we are first going to hear from our panelists who are finding solutions to this issue. They're going to give us a few minutes of opening comments. We're going to go straight into Q&A. So just as a reminder, please use that chat function at any point going forward to ask your questions. With that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, and I would like to say back by popular demand, as she is a repeat speaker on this in this series, is Tracy Chang, who's chef and owner of Pagu. She is an alum of the James Beard Foundation Boot Camp for Policy and Change program, as well as a 2020 James Beard Best Chef Northeast semifinalist. She's the co-founder of Off Their Plate and Project Restore Us, which are 2 initiatives that are dedicated to feeding those in need while also providing economic relief to restaurants. So welcome back, Tracy. We also have Thomas McQuillan, who's Vice President of Corporate Strategy, Culture, and Sustainability at Baldor Specialty Foods. He's been there since 2015, tasked with creating a strategic plan to make Baldor more sustainable. Thomas spearheaded the Sparks, which for your information is scraps, spelled backwards, initiative, and the goal there being to reduce food waste throughout the company. And then finally, we have Matt Schwartz, co-founder and CEO of Fresh Technologies, which, as it sounds, is a fresh food technology company. Prior to founding Fresh, Matt launched a snack company called Stat Foods. He worked in food tech at the production board and also managed operations at Simple Mills. So very excited to have such diverse representation throughout the supply chain on our call today, and I think very different perspectives on the issue that we're going to be discussing. So with no further delay, let's dive in. I'd love to hear, as I said, from our panelists. Let's go ahead and go in that order of the introduction. So Tracy, Thomas, and Matt. Where I'd love to start the conversation today is to hear from you about what inventory and demand planning or forecasting challenges you're seeing as a result of COVID-19 throughout the food supply chain? And then what scalable solutions or best practices do you want to share with the group to overcome those challenges? And with that, Tracy, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you guys for having me back. I'm Tracy Chang. I'm the chef owner of Pagu Restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In March, COVID-19 started to hit our area. Prior to that, in December, January, we were already seeing it affect our friends and families in Italy and China as well. So to prepare my team in March, just before the government mandate for our state in Massachusetts, before they shut us down, we decided to shut ourselves down. So we closed for dine-in around mid-March, and we launched Off Their Plate to feed healthcare workers and employee restaurant employees. So the mission was to, keep these essential workers employed. At the same time, restaurants were, some were doing takeout and some were, trying to figure out what to do with their inventories, et cetera. So in doing that, we also started a few other initiatives. We noticed a need for food insecurity work, so we started Project Restore Us. We started a local grocery market just within our restaurant space that we called the Pagu Market to feed our neighbors in the community, and also to take care of the inventory to kind of move products in various different ways. So the key for us was to really innovate and to diversify our revenue streams and strategies so that we could remain sustainable as a business and also stick to our core values, continue to serve, continue to survive ourselves, but also take care of our employees, take care of our purveyors. So, some of the creative things that we did with our menu was that we removed items that didn't make sense. These items didn't make sense for takeout. They didn't make sense for sustainability. So we took off any kind of, sashimi, any kind of raw fish, and we started looking towards, what were the trends? How were people eating during a pandemic? And we noticed that folks were moving towards comfort foods. So what does that mean? That means a lot of pizza, a lot of Mexican food was doing quite well during this time. Braised and confit items as well. So we actually shifted our menu to include pizzas and hand-pulled noodles. And we're a Japanese Spanish tapas restaurant. So, people might think, what are we doing making pizza? I mean, it's something that people can eat 3 times a week. It's something that you can do your own twist on, so you don't have to feel like as a business and as an entity and as an identity, especially for, I guess, a chef-driven restaurant, that you have to really, I guess, like stick to the same kind of checkbox of, what you might have told Yelp that your restaurant category was. So, this was fun, I think, for our kitchen. This was interesting to see the data. And more importantly, this was pretty low waste. We were able to do pizzas, hand-pulled noodles. We were able to move these products also as kits in our grocery market. So people wanted to make pizza, they wanted to make hand-pulled noodles, they wanted to make nachos at home. We were able to take items like our pork, our tomato, make ricotta from milk, do these things that chefs typically do to minimize waste while sticking to, our original values of wanting to support our local farms, wanting to support, the people that have always supported us, and continuing to employ our essential workers. So we actually saw as well that folks were willing to pre-order these items, and that these items, if available in large format, were also quite popular. And you're probably wondering, like, how the heck were you, doing this like takeout business? Like, how busy could you really be doing takeout, right? Because we didn't have patio dining yet until probably May, June. And to be honest, like, our revenue, our sales were not huge. And that's why we had to do so many different things, right? So we were doing the healthcare meals. We were also cooking for homeless shelters with the city of Cambridge. Now we've also started feeding community centers with World Central Kitchen, and kind of a combination of all of these things helped to keep us afloat. And at the same time, we were able to increase our own Pagu market to offer more than 170 items. And you might think, oh, well, how is it that she's selling fresh bok choy? Like, how is it that the kale's not going bad? And it's because a combination of all of these things and kind of being smart with your menu and kind of where everything can overlap and intertwine makes it so that those products move, out of the walk-in. And onto the plates and into the grocery boxes and into the meal kits of these families, of the guests that come to the restaurant, into the homes of people who are cooking at home. And so, that, I guess, equation and kind of medley of all the different things that we tried, worked well together. And I don't know that any one of them would have been enough to sustain us as a business. And I don't think that any one of them, would have been enough to really move product efficiently and responsibly.
Thank you, Tracy. I think it's really interesting how you share that so much of this starts with the menu design, which in turn starts with what consumers want. So I think that's a great place to start the conversation, is around meeting consumer needs through all of this. So I'm sure we'll be back to that when we get to Q&A. Thomas, over to you.
Well, first, let me say thank you very much, Jackie. First, let me say it's so nice to see so many friends. I see Warren's on and Steve and Dana and so on. So I'm really excited to know that you're well and healthy and able to join today. So good to know you're here and listening. Baldor Specialty Foods. So March 13th, 2020, we are a 75% food service distributor, 15 to 20% retail, balance being wholesale, but all of that wholesale ultimately makes its way into food service. So we're roughly an 85% food service distributor. And what is really fascinating is this idea that we were able to, as a leadership team, morph the company from a B2B company to a B2C company from March 1st in planning to about March 15th. We just got very lucky in the fact that we were ready by March 15th to start selling B2C, business to consumer, home deliveries, because the restaurant scene in our geographical range from Portland, Maine, Boston, down through New York into DC, pretty much closed up overnight. When we think about the supply chain for the business, we have about 3 days worth of inventory at any given time. And just to give you an idea of Baldor's scope, not only are we delivering that range, but at that time we would have around 425 trucks on the road every day delivering to your favorite restaurants. So we had a huge impact into that market. And with that business going away overnight, what are we going to do with all these trucks? What do we do with our infrastructure? And, we had to retrain the drivers to go from delivering to the same 12 to 15 spots that they would go to pretty much every day to maybe 20 to 22 homes where they had never been before, with a 16 pallet position truck going down narrow roads in Sag Harbor, New York. So we really flipped our model as a business overnight. Those of you who know me and have heard me talk about some of the work that I do at Baldor, we are a zero organics to landfill company. We aren't perfect. We do make some mistakes from time to time, but we have policies in place here at Baldor to fully utilize all food. We do not refer to food as the W word ever. It's not part of our lexicon. We only refer to full usage of food. So there's never any W here when it comes to food. There's W when it comes to other items, things like used tires perhaps, or maybe some products that aren't recyclable, but we're always looking to find homes for all of those items too. The good news is from 2016 to today, we have reduced the percentage of products that would make it to landfill by 73% as a company, most of that being food. Since November 10, 2016, we've put 100% of the food that remains from our food production here, that goes into distribution, and any food that's that we manage here in our cafeteria, returns from drivers, damaged food, 100% of that food is either captured for animal or human consumption, or it is turned into compost. But in no instance do we take food and commingle it with what gets sent to landfill. And that makes us a zero organics to landfill company. Since November 10, 2016, we've been able to divert over 25 million pounds of food from landfill. That starts to inform everything that we do at Baldor, and we just make a concerted effort throughout our supply chain not to have any waste. One of the things I just want to also point out that comes as news to a lot of people is that we do have 3 days of inventory here, but remember on March 14th, when all the restaurants closed, behind that inventory was about 5 days on the road of trucks barreling their way to New York and Boston and DC to fill our warehouses. Things like 3-pound packs of spinach. And who are we going to sell that to if the restaurants are closed? So we were able to maintain our business with our nursing homes and hospitals. But other than that, our corporate business is closed, schools closed, restaurants closed. None of that's news to any of you. But what were we going to do with all that food? And this is a good time to put a plug in for the donation partners we work so closely with, because we really needed their support to make sure we were able to place this food. And I'm proud to say that over a 6-week period, we donated over 4,000 pallets of food, which is roughly 150 truckloads, tractor-trailer loads of food. And that food was able to make it into the most desperate areas of our cities and feed the most food insecure. And we did that through the partnerships that already existed through food banks, City Harvest, Compassion Coalition, et cetera. And so I would encourage everyone on the call to think about those relationships you build as you build your business with others in the community that will come to your aid in times of need. And you might think to yourself, well, you must have been doing them a huge favor. And in fact, we were, because we were feeding them food insecure. But you have to remember, as we heard from Chef Tracy, she was also trying to find a home for food, as well as all of the restaurants. So we were sort of competing to put these resources to work. And there was no way we could have done that on our own. And those partnerships remain strong. We continue to work together to find ways to take food in the supply chain and get it into the bellies of all people, including those among us who are food insecure. So the supply chain, in one word, remains uncertain, not so much on the production side and on the harvesting side necessarily, but on what will the market look like, and what should the packaging look like, and what should the format of that food come to Baldor, and so we can get it into the hands of our chefs and our donation partners when necessary, et cetera, that it can be put to our people at home, so that it can be put to use. And that remains to be our single greatest challenge. Trying to have visibility into, for example, in this region, when will restaurants open in New Jersey and New York City? And how can we think about planning for that when there's such a long time horizon to that supply chain? So those are the things that we're thinking about these days.
Thank you, Thomas. Great thoughts. And I think what I loved, especially about your comments there at the end, is how I think especially with inventory and demand planning, we can often limit ourselves to thinking within the 4 walls in which we operate. And so I love your comment on partnership and thinking about whether that's recovery partners or others. There are likely a lot of other people we can be working with to strengthen that supply chain as a whole. So again, really great comments, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of that when we get to Q&A. And last but certainly not least, Matt, let's turn it over to you.
Yeah, hey everyone, and thanks so much for having me. I'm super grateful to be able to lend a little bit of perspective. We're in the business of serving large brick and mortar grocery chains, and we've been relentlessly focused throughout the duration of our company on thinking about inventory and demand planning which on their face may not be the most kind of attractive or riveting topics, but I think what I've come to really believe and appreciate is the transformative impact that decision-making in the supply chain can have on the ultimate financials of a business. And then when we think about the health of both people and our planet, the price at which we can provide fresh, nutritious food to people, and how much food ultimately gets wasted, which affects our environment. And so honored to be a part of the panel, and hopefully some of what I shared today can be helpful coming from more of a technology perspective in how various food businesses can reduce their waste, increase their profitability, and ultimately get food to people who need it in a trying moment in time, like the one we face right now. And I think some of the perspective that I would love to share is a little bit of what we saw in working with our grocery partners at the onset of the pandemic here in the US, and then some of what we saw happen afterwards, and the results that we saw when it came to food waste, availability of food, the profitability of these enterprises, their ability to use their existing labor in stores to make decisions and operate their businesses. And at a high level, what I would say is at the very onset of this, we saw these gigantic spikes in demand for grocers. And a lot of the traditional kind of demand forecasting and inventory practices that might have existed were immediately almost thrown out the window when you see demand that is hundreds of percentages higher than it ever has been before over a period of time, and seeing crazy spikes in demand for these grocers. And having to deal with that and try to understand what to do with your inventory in a situation like that is pretty difficult. At the same time, it's really important to get right. If you think about the perishability of food, grocers are always kind of walking the knife's edge when it comes to either carrying too much or carrying too little. If you carry too little, you run the risk of really disappointing a customer and showing an out of stock. And if you carry too much, you throw it away, and with really thin margins, that can really devastate your bottom line and challenge your profitability. And so I think at the very onset of this, there was a mad scramble just to have enough food in the stores. But in perishables, it's kind of a balance of having enough food, but not having too much. And I think that tactically, some of the guidance I might be able to provide is, again, we came out of Stanford's grad program in AI to start this company, and are applying some of the absolute cutting edge of artificial intelligence to augment the decision-making of operators in these food businesses. But there are definitely some best practices that we saw that might work for retailers or food service providers, agnostic of what technology they have on offer for their team. And so some of the things that I might think about in talking about that and what we saw drive success is being more disciplined about a few decisions that are really impactful. So concretely, paying attention to the highest kind of volume items that are that people are demanding, and spending a little bit more time in stores making decisions. So an example of this might be to say, I'm going to spend a little bit more time than I normally would otherwise understanding how many bananas I'm going to order into my store, and take a little bit more time. And for context, I think one of the big challenges that retailers always have, but that has been exacerbated by this crisis, is the lack of time that people have in managing these stores, because things are just flying off the shelves. They're super busy. There's just more work to be done. But spending a little bit more time in really high impact moments of making a decision can really move the needle and create a virtuous circle of benefit to a retailer. So specifically, if you spend a little bit more time trying to anticipate how many bananas you should order, you will better place that order. You might in turn have less inventory in your back rooms, which in turn make for less labor in your store when you have to rotate those boxes, and in turn enable you to deliver better product to the customer. And so you have this example of spending a little bit more time in a decision-making process that in turn drives much less time in running the actual business and doing some of the harder core kind of labor. That's kind of one example. Another example that we saw for those companies that might have existing kind of legacy technologies is on unlike more modern kind of AI demand forecasting technologies that can more quickly catch on to new trends, a lot of historical forecasting we saw was kind of looking at year-over-year sales. And in March, when sales spiked up, multiple hundreds of percentages, multiple times week over week, the forecast from last year in March became quickly irrelevant. So getting people to look at sales from last week or 2 weeks ago, as opposed to what they were selling a year ago, it's a cruder process, but it enables you to get a better, kind of more foresight into what the needs of your store and what demand might look like. So shortening the aperture of the time frame that you look at and trying to forecast your needs is something that we saw be really helpful. So in summary, I think, we would love to dive deeper into it, but what we saw with our partners is really trying to empower store level associates to make better decisions on the 80-20 set of items that are really impactful for their bottom line and for labor requirements in the store. And in doing so, we saw food waste at our partners. We're partnered with multiple multi-billion-dollar chains go down roughly 25% year over year, while seeing their sales actually increase by about multiple, many percentages kind of year over year, and also making do with the existing labor that they have in the store. So I guess I would close in just saying that there's a lot of benefit that comes out of taking the time to really do the potentially not glamorous tasks of demand forecasting and inventory optimization. It can be really transformative for the overall food business.
Thank you, Matt. I love that I think just general life rule sometimes that a little investment of time up front often saves lots of time down the road. So I think that's a great philosophy to keep in mind. With that, we're going to go ahead and shift over to Q&A. So again, just a reminder to the comments and questions name that you see in your chat box. That's where you can be submitting any questions you have. A couple themes of questions already here that I'd like to ask. The first, I think, actually, Matt, I'm going to go back to you and would love Thomas and Tracy to chime in here as well. But I think it builds on what you were just talking about, which is around the business case for improving inventory and demand planning. And you talked a little bit about the time savings already, but I'm curious what other comments you have or others that help to talk about the investment, whether that's money or time that it takes to do this well. Acknowledging that investment may vary across food businesses and the sophistication of technology may vary across food businesses. So can you just maybe speak a little more to some of that business case? And then again, Thomas and Tracy, feel free to add anything.
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about the upside first, and then I'll talk a little bit about the costs, and then try and talk about a rough return on investment or something like that. I'll try and do it relatively concisely. I think for context, for some of these large grocery chains, they could be doing $1 billion in produce sales, call it. And average shrink or food waste in produce across the industry, it can range world-class, kind of best-in-class 4% to average of 6 to 8% or so in waste. And so it may not sound like a huge number, but on $1 billion revenue, 6% waste is $60 million of food waste that they're throwing away. And again, going back to kind of the really slim net margins of these businesses, if you're running a 2% net margin on your aggregate business, the $60 million in waste that you're throwing away could be the same size as your total profit for your entire enterprise. And so if you can make a 25% reduction in your food waste, you can increase your EBITDA or your profit margin by 25%, which is just a kind of mind-boggling fact. And then I think the other part of it that should be a huge incentive for food retailers is to think about the upside to consumers. And so this is kind of a really critical period of time in which consumers are revisiting their shopping habits and thinking about what they do and how they eat. And if you capitalize on that by having food available to people and giving them a good experience in your stores, that could be a new loyal customer for a long time. And just in the immediate moment, you could capitalize by having a banana to sell them as opposed to no bananas at all. So there's a lot of upside there. And I think the last piece I would just talk about, you alluded to some of the labor efficiencies. I think there's just generally a lot of virtue to running a leaner business. It ends up being less onerous for people in stores. They're able to spend more time in front of customers, helping them and things like that. So overall, I think that these are hard problems, tremendously hard problems that grocers and other food companies have had to deal with for decades. And historically, technology may not have been really well suited to fresh categories in some of these really labor-intense industries. And as a result, decision-making was kind of reached its local maximum of 6% waste. But we believe that there's a global optimal of 3%, 2% or lower in some of these really perishable categories that could completely be a paradigm shift for the profitability of these industries. So I'm probably putting on a little bit of the sell, so I apologize for that. But that's like what we really see as being the genuine upside, which has phenomenal impact on the P&L and on the planet when it comes to reducing waste. When it comes to cost, I wouldn't downplay the difficulty of implementing a solution. It requires change, it requires technical integration. But again, the lift is really worth it. And the last piece of it I would just say is advent in technology has enabled more human-centered design to take place, and more modern software architectures have enabled systems to kind of be augmented instead of completely ripped out and replaced. And so when we think about how long it takes us to partner with a new customer, it takes a couple months as opposed to years and years. So in a moment of time like this, it can be hard. I think at first, a lot of retailers that we saw were just kind of scrambling to make their businesses work, kind of making a big tech change was something that was really hard for people to swallow. But now that things have kind of settled into a little bit more of a new normal, I think you'll start to see savvy, smart kind of food enterprises starting to adopt new technologies to help them operate better going forward. And then, as I alluded to before, I think I'll cut off my answer for not being too long, but there's a lot of things that I think process-wise, smaller retailers or retailers that may not invest as much in technology can do to be more deliberate in that kind of decision-making process to make a lot of things happen with less money or less budget for technological adoption.
Really great insights. Thank you, Matt. Thomas or Tracy, anything you want to add here before we go on to a different topic?
I think, Tracy, if you don't mind, I'll just mention that one of the comments that Matt made earlier was that spend time in the store, and I think you're spending time in the store to really understand what the customer needs. One of the reasons why we had so many shortages and so many products, and there was such a run on so many products in the United States and around the world, the suppliers have shaved down inventories to such a bare bones minimum because they've been told this is a great way to save money, be just in time. And we see the downside of that. You know, we see the fact that we didn't have a day's supply of masks on hand countrywide in a time of need. It really is important when we run our businesses to look externally and understand from the customers what their needs are and what they want to purchase as opposed to what we want to sell. And purchasing teams often think more about what they want to sell. And I think, to capitalize on another comment that Matt made when he was suggesting to the procurement teams, look back 2 weeks to demand plan as opposed to last year. It's a different world. I would encourage them to do that all the time, because what we tend to do as procurement teams is we tend to buy with the things that we think we need as opposed to the things that our customers want. That is a big deal when we think about how to move forward in this environment, particularly because the future is still so uncertain. One other example for Baldo that I'd like to give is when we think about the way we manage food, before we had our solution to fully utilize all food, we were paying about $110 a ton to send food to the transfer station, which I was told was being composted. Whether it was or not, I don't know, but most likely it made it to landfill. But whether or not it was composted, we were able to find a solution working with a feed company to reduce the cost of getting that food to be manufactured into a feed down to $66 a ton. And when you think about the fact that we were processing at that time about 150,000 pounds a week, and it's just increased since then, so 150,000 pounds savings from 110 to $66, you can do the math. It's well into six figures a year of savings. So to make Matt's point, by coming up with these kinds of solutions, not only are you doing the right thing, you're creating economic value for your organization. But the other piece that I just want to mention to the group, what tends to happen, and what's happened here, I believe, is the employees start looking at all the assets of the company differently because they understand that we want to glean value from all assets, not just the way we used to think about the value of the asset. So if all food is usable and all food is an asset, we're going to treat it differently than if we consider it in any part of its life cycle waste.
That's actually a really good segue, Thomas, into a couple of questions we have around consumers. So Tracy, maybe I'll go to you first here, and this will be a sneak preview to next week's installment, which will dive actually entirely into consumer trends. But questions around what are you seeing consumers demand these days that might be affecting your demand planning and inventory decisions? I know, Tracy, you mentioned comfort foods as part of your introduction. So any additional insights you and others have? And the related question being, have you seen success at all in being able to drive consumer demand towards items that you may have stuck in inventory and in stock and having trouble moving? So Tracy, I'll let you start. And then once again, Thomas and Matt, if you have anything that you want to add.
Thanks. Yeah, so using a few examples just from our own market and menu, like I mentioned, people were moving towards comfort foods. Some of these kind of restaurant trends, studies, kind of newsletters that I subscribe to, we're sending out reports of, trends in fast casual, trends in kind of like drive-through, et cetera. And then just kind of listening to what our immediate community was saying about challenges finding things in their local grocers or their reservations to go out because of general safety cautions. So what we did was, like I said, comfort foods, pizza, nachos, hand-pulled noodles. In the grocery store, we noticed that, there was this lack of flour, right? Like maybe some people notice this across the country of, oh, I can't find flour in my local grocery store and I'm baking sourdough at home. And so we looked at what else besides flour were people trying to purchase that we could get from our suppliers. And from Baldor, there was no shortage of flours. And we saw that we had guests coming who wanted, all these different kinds of flours, who were experimenting at home. And we sold it by the pound, by the 5-pound, and by the 50-pound bag. And there were folks interested in buying in bulk because some folks, early on in March and April were stocking up because they didn't know how long they'd be at home. And so this was the case for not just flour, but for yeast, certainly with PPE. So we were able to source gloves and sanitizer. That was something that we weren't selling in our market, but we were just providing for folks. There's that whole toilet paper frenzy. But because these were, regulars of our restaurant and, neighbors in our community, we just threw in, the extra masks and the extra gloves and the extra sanitizer and the extra toilet paper just as, an added thank you for continuing to support us. On the grocery front, one of the things that we also noticed as someone who has absolutely no experience prior to this running a grocery store, we noticed that, some folks might be looking for that one item of yeast or flour, and then they come to your grocery store online and they find out that, oh, you happen to sell hot sauce, you happen to sell cookie dough. And even though we don't have that candy aisle at the checkout, we find that folks who have never come to our restaurant before, but happen to live in the area and, saw on the Cambridge, City of Cambridge website or something that we were running this store, they pick up something and they try it for the first time and they enjoy it and they come back. So we actually saw that our Pagu branded products were bringing people in and bringing people back. And like I said, those items, because we were preserving items, we were making jam, we're making hot sauce, we're making umami oil, which is our kind of version of exo sauce. So we were, turning those ingredients into our own CPG essentially, so consumer packaged good. And then one other fun thing that we were doing, I had, again, no idea about this trend because I was not going out to grocery stores. I was working 7 days a week. And my cousin messaged me from California and she said, Trace, you have to go to Trader Joe's and get ube mochi pancake mix. I was like, what are you talking about? And she said, they're sold out all on the West Coast. This is a big deal. Like, you love purple things, purple products, purple everything. Like, maybe you should just make your own at Pagu and see if, people will buy it. So we made purple pancake mix, and we sold it in the store just to see like who wants to buy purple pancake mix. And so we did have people come in who were just looking for purple pancake mix, and at the same time we're like, oh, well, also get this jam and that jam, and oh, they have cookie dough, or oh, they have hand pulled noodles, something they had never tried before. So I guess it's, listening to those crazy ideas from cousins on the other side of the country, that sometimes work. It's listening to the neighbors around us. It's looking at the larger trends of these restaurant industry reports. But yeah, just generally like staying positive and not kind of turning down crazy, wacky ideas during a pandemic.
A note to myself to try purple pancakes someday. But I love the theme of creativity and positivity in that approach, Tracy, and just finding new ways to make products relevant to consumers and to bring them in. That's great. Would love, if there's any other comments, Thomas and Matt, feel free to add on. Otherwise, we have a couple of questions here. I want to go back. I think, Matt, it was you that mentioned in part of your comments how there's a balance between having too much or too little kind of on hand. And I think, so there's a question in here as we look to this new normal, maybe across, again, all three of you, or Thomas and Matt, to chime in. Do you think that there will be a new normal as well as what that balance point is between having too much and too little? We're seeing new ways of consuming food, both in restaurants and otherwise, and new ways of purchasing food. And so just curious what effects you think that will have on kind of on-hand inventory.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take a pass on it. It's a fun, I think, conceptual question. I think on the margin, there's probably going to be a lot more incentive for at least grocers, as I think about it, to err on stocking a little bit more. Because if you don't ever know when the next big run or next big kind of news surprise is, then you might be a little bit more cautious and hold on to a little bit more inventory. And ultimately, I think that's really not a good thing. I think, Thomas was saying some really interesting, he was making an interesting point about there's these trade-offs of, wanting to make sure that you do have enough, and not being too kind of short-sighted. And I think that is definitely true. And that's like the natural incentive. But if you kind of have this mindset of asymmetric downside risk, if I don't carry too much, or if I don't carry a lot, I could end up missing out. Then over time, that's going to chip away at your profitability and ultimately cause a really inefficient business. And so I think ultimately, and this is like probably more of the nerdy kind of high tech answer here, is that actually that balance of supply versus demand, or ultimately the safety stock that you carry, and how much buffer you really are allowing yourself to have, is something that could actually be computed and optimized using some of these AI technologies. And that's actually one of the underpinnings of how our software works, is that you can predict what a profit maximizing quantity for your back room is, that enables you to avoid the downside of carrying too much and throwing things away, and also hit your upside of carrying enough. And you can then dial that more or less based on your level of confidence in that demand forecast. And I think ultimately there's been a lot of ego in technology in the past, and a lot of thinking that we can just fully automate everything and perfect it. And I think the last thing I'll just say is that one of the ways that we've personally tried to get around that is by empowering people as opposed to just trying to automate decisions away. And what I mean by that is every one of the kind of we might make about how much to order, how many bananas to order, if I make it that simple, we're then presenting to a human, if we're uncertain about it, to let them kind of toggle it and make those adjustments, because they might know that that banana is a part of a recipe for like a purple banana pancake recipe or something like that. And that you might have a spike in demand better than a system might know. And so long story short, I think that there's going to be incentive to probably overstock, but I'd be afraid of that in the long run because it could really cause a lot of waste and inefficiencies in businesses. And so I'd be excited to kind of see ways that people try to avoid that. But I don't know, that's a lot of conjecture, I would say.
Hey, Jackie, I just want to say on that point, when you were talking about, how the business has shifted, we're approaching 50% specialty food sales as opposed to 50% produce. We used to be, 2 years ago, we were an 80% produce distributor. We were 85% the year before. I am a big proponent of fresh produce as something that should absolutely be in everyone's diet. I get a little concerned when we start moving so rapidly towards packaged foods. When I say packaged foods, it could be healthy, maybe not. But one of the reasons why I think anecdotally people are moving towards packaged foods is we can fill our pantries with them and know that we're good for a couple of weeks, or we don't have to worry about eating that tomato sauce or that pasta right away. Whereas if we buy fresh flour from Chef Tracy and tomatoes from Baldor to make our fresh pasta, well, we got to eat that soon is maybe what we're thinking. But I do think that there needs to be a continued push on produce and fresh. I get concerned when the boxes that we're going to feed to the food insecure have less produce and more processed foods in them, because that's precisely what we shouldn't be eating during this pandemic. And we can't make it easy for us, those that are providing the food, and compromise in any way, shape, or form the health of the people that are eating. So we need to keep fresh produce front and center. The other thing I'll mention is merchandising in and of itself is an amazing art form, and in the retail units, and Chef Tracy touched on it, admitting that before this she had no experience in retail and now she has a lot. Merchandising is powerful, and the reason why it's powerful is the way that the customer perceives their whole shopping experience could be completely tilted by one empty aisle. There's nothing that made people feel more unsettled than walking down the paper aisle, which everybody thought should be the easiest thing to stock in a store, which was the one thing that was the hardest to find. And tell people they can't have paper towels, tissues, and toilet paper, and all of a sudden the world is coming to them. And we all lived that 3 months ago. And again, it got back to a couple points. Those providers, those manufacturers have really pared down their inventories to save money. But look what it cost them in the long run. They lost a lot of sales. People came up with all kinds of alternatives from these products. And going forward, you're going to see that people are going to continue to hoard, to a certain extent, these kind of shelf-stable items. And it's not just people, it's companies doing it, it's restaurants doing it. And I see it as a consistent sort of purchasing issue, is that we're moving more towards these kinds of products. I think we need to reverse that and get back to fresh. And I'd like to see that trend happen.
Quick follow-up question for you, Thomas. Maybe something else that Matt mentioned in his response was just the importance of human-centeredness in that technology design. I'd be curious, as you think about the importance of human-centeredness, how you use that in your teams to kind of motivate the focus on the changes that you're making, and big business model changes, let alone some of the inventory changes.
Well, I love that question. I didn't expect that today, but I love it. When the protests were going on in New York City, we had an opportunity through our local councilman, Salamanca, to make a very large donation to an area that was struggling with food insecurity here in the Bronx. And I was asked to bring 10 pallets of food to distribute to the elderly living in this facility. And of course I said yes, and it was Wednesday morning. I think the protest started on Monday or Tuesday. And I remember people suggesting to me, like, oh my gosh, is that safe? Do you feel comfortable? And all I know is, if you're going to be in this business of food, we need to serve people, all people, and show love. I think food does a wonderful job of sharing love, and with love comes hope. And there was no time we needed it more. And I think that's what lifts the human spirit, this idea that we can do so much with food, and we can do so many horrible things with food too. So it's an opportunity to really showcase our humanity by sharing nutritious and delicious food, and not being so arrogant to think that, well, I have enough and I'm not worried if you have any. That's what needs to change. We need to fully utilize all food. You've heard me talk about the food asset potential. For me, that means that all food is used always. That means we feed humans, we feed animals, we create our future soil system. That leaves no room for waste. That makes refed obsolete, which I think is a wonderful thing, and it creates opportunities for us to fully utilize all the food assets in our possession to feed ourselves, to feed others around us. It's powerful, and it's where we need to get to, and we're approaching that, and I'm really excited about the potential.
Great comments, Thomas. Thank you. Well, we're getting close to time, so maybe just one more lightning round opportunity for people to chime in. I think my closing question for panelists is really looking to the future, which we've talked about in a few of your responses already, but any other key learnings you haven't had the chance to share yet that you think we can be using both during and post-pandemic and in future situations like this, should they happen, to be building a more resilient food system through forecasting and demand planning solutions. So we are short on time, so ask for kind of, as I said, the quick lightning round responses here, but would love to hear final thoughts before we go ahead and wrap up. Thomas, I see you unmuted, so let's start with you, and then we can go to Matt and Tracy.
Yeah, the key is flexibility. One of the most wonderful things that's come out of COVID-19 for me is that the chefs have become flexible, finally. You know, there was a time just 6 months ago that, and I'm sure Chef Tracy can tell you the war stories here, where chefs had to have a particular product. We are so past that. We are so flexible now. We're like, you know, if that's not on the menu, it's okay. I'm able to communicate with farmers, hey, it's all right if you have that product. Maybe we can help push that. And everybody's feeling like there's something patriotic about being flexible and willing to adjust to the food that we have available to us today. And I think there's a lot of promise behind that. Full food utilization is really going to save us a lot of aggravation long term, put food to use, get food into the bellies of the food insecure. So I'm really happy about the prospect that flexibility brings to us.
Great.
Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah. So I think what I'd say, I'm inspired by a couple things that Thomas said. Both, one, the conviction about driving more fresh, nutritious food to people, and two, the flexibility. And I think the higher arching kind of motivation for the company that we started at Afresh, and our deep conviction, is that the past of our food system was really about making enough calories to feed people, and we did that really well with processed foods. But fresh food is harder, and where more nutrition lies, and it inherently is way more challenging given its extreme perishability, the dynamic nature of its availability, and a bunch of other things like this. And so I'm very hopeful for modern approaches to technology and augmenting people to enable us to make more dynamic decisions that in turn enable us to get more fresh food to more people without necessarily having to have everything in a perfectly shaped box and barcode. And so I think times like this really are emblematic of a moment in time in which really thoughtful technology and decision-making around our supply chain and inventory can actually facilitate a future in which fresh, nutritious food is accessible to everyone and far less wasteful.
Thank you, Matt. And Tracy, bring us home.
Yeah, you know, I think before the pandemic, as chefs, restaurant owners, business operators, we wanted to cook what we wanted to cook, and people who liked to eat out, you know, we fed people who wanted to come here and to eat, versus feeding people who need to eat. And so, you know, I think it's important to not only innovate and be flexible and diversify our revenue streams moving forward, but just remembering, you know, why we do this, why we you know, why we work in this profession, why we cook, why we, you know, are restaurant operators in particular. The root of the word restaurant is to restore. And that's, you know, a reminder to me during this pandemic that, you know, we're here for others and to serve others. And so if that means, you know, completely pivoting your business to something that you've never done before, even though that might be scary or that might be not ideal for a lot of people, you know, I've talked to other chefs, other restaurant owners that were like, you know, I can't make it through today. Like, I don't want to run a grocery store. I don't want to, you know, change to a takeout business. And I guess for me, it's less about, you know, whether I want to do those things versus what my community needs of me and what my employees need of me. And so, you know, just again, being more so on the listening side and understanding, you know, what do people need, and, you know, designing, like Matt said, having that human-centered approach, you know, designing for what people need.
What great closing comments, Tracy. That is such a wonderful way to wrap up the call today. With that, I'm just going to say a big thank you to all of our panelists. You'll notice that Nathan just sent a link through the chat function. If you had questions or comments we didn't get to today, as well as feedback on the session, you can provide that there. And then we'll be back next week at the same time, as I mentioned, for a conversation around consumers and consumer behavior change during and after COVID-19. So again, a huge thank you everyone for joining and spending the time with us today. Really appreciate just the expertise and the preparation of our panelists. And we will get a recap and these best practices out to you shortly. Thank you and have a great day.